Hi Cal. So a little while back you were talking to me about John Green's videos on Romeo and Juliet, and you said that you really liked the way he presented it because he interacted with Romeo and Juliet in a way that you had never really had a chance to look at it before. And so for today's video I thought I would give you a look at Romeo and Juliet that you also have probably never had, something that John Green didn't mention in his video. Romeo and Juliet might not have actually been a tragedy. Okay, well at least not at first. As written, there's a lot of evidence that it was more of a romantic comedy with an M. Night Shyamalan twist at the end that turned it into a tragedy. See, whenever we read something or watch something, it tends to be that ending that really sticks with us despite everything that led up to it. Just ask anyone who's ever played Mass Effect 3. But we tend to forget about everything that led up to the ending. And over the years, Romeo and Juliet has evolved into more of a dramatic, tragic play in our minds. But think about some of the tropes that have evolved from Romeo and Juliet. Whenever you have a scene of two families, one from each, they fall in love, hijinks ensue, you're almost always talking about a romantic comedy. That trope is either used to cause tension or comedy between the characters, and typically, if it focuses on the love story, it's going to be for comic purposes, and if the love story is only a smaller subplot of a bigger thing like warring factions or families or anything like that, then it's going to be a tragedy, but the whole show isn't going to be about that couple. But in Romeo and Juliet, the focus is on this couple, which is really going to shake up the audience expectations. So try to imagine watching Romeo and Juliet in 16th or 17th century England. You're standing around, it's really crowded, it's kind of smelly. The play starts, someone comes on and he gives you this backstory about two star-crossed lovers, blah blah blah, okay, get on with it. And then the play starts. Our first introduction to Romeo is that he is madly in love with a girl who is not Juliet. Of course that doesn't really last long, and soon he's head over heels in love with Juliet. Now this is where a lot of modern audiences sort of write off the story, because Romeo is supposed to either be a teenager or just kind of a stupid young adult. So people wonder why we should even care about this love that's clearly going to pass if he would just survive the week. Except that's sort of the joke. Shakespeare does actually know what he's doing, and a lot of the comedy that's going to come out of this is going to come from these two young lovers' totally unrealistic expectations of what love is going to be like. So going back to that whole romantic comedy analogy, you can already start to fit a lot of these characters into tropes. Romeo is that friend that we've all had that falls in love like twice a month and every single time it's the one. Juliet is the sweet, naive girl in love for the first time. Their parents are a bunch of adults that just don't understand them. Juliet is supposed to end up with another man who's, not a bad guy, but she doesn't love him. And of course she has an overprotective family member that wants Romeo to stay the hell away from her. And then there's Mercutio, who's sort of like Romeo's wingman through all of this, and as you were probably told in middle or high school when you first looked at this play, he's the comic relief. He says things like, "Appear thou in the likeness of a sigh, speak one rhyme, and I am satisfied." And then your teacher told you that that was one of Mercutio's jokes, and you were like, it is? But let's just assume that Shakespeare's audience has got the jokes, and no one's going to argue that there aren't jokes in Romeo and Juliet. There are a bunch of them, and most of them do come from Mercutio. Now, unfortunately, a common interpretation of those jokes is that it was just to keep the rabble entertained while they got to the actual plot of the story. But the truth is, the entire first half is designed to be comic. It's not just a few jokes thrown in to shake things up. This is supposed to be a funny chunk of play. See, there's a lot of things that can really be played up for comedic effect that we don't really do anymore because our audiences are going in with the expectation of a tragedy. Take the nurse, for example. There's a specific scene that I'm going to come back to later about her, but just think of the way that the nurse is portrayed now. She's usually very matriarchally, she cares for Juliet, she's just trying to do the best. She wants Juliet to be happy, but she wants her to be safe. You sympathize for her. She's kind of a comic relief because she's going to come on and interrupt their love scenes, but the nurse could have totally been played up in Shakespeare's day. Think about it, everyone on stage then was portrayed by a man. So in the case of Juliet, it was a man dressed up as a woman who was supposed to be convincing, but in the case of a comic relief character like the nurse, the man might not be even a very convincing outfit. That sort of gender stereotype is used for over-the-top humor. It makes all of the nurse's lines that much funnier. Basically, just picture Mrs. Doubtfire as the nurse and you'll sort of see where I'm headed with this. I mean, the nurse really does love Juliet, but she's supposed to be a ridiculous character. And then you've got the dialogue between Romeo and Juliet. They speak in these poetic, flowery languages. Remember how the first time you read Romeo and Juliet, you were thinking to yourself that this is kind of stupid because no one would ever talk like that? Once again, that's the joke. Shakespeare is well aware that these guys have no idea what they're getting into, and what they believe about love is the things that they believe love should be about. Basically, they're stupid kids, and it's ridiculous because it's supposed to be, and we're supposed to laugh at it. It's okay. And later when Mercutio and Romeo get into trouble and a fight breaks out, once again, at first this is supposed to be a sort of, these are just young people with tempers. But then, spoiler alert, Mercutio dies. So at that point it's not a comedy, right? I mean, his best friend's dead, where do you go from there? Well, not quite. Dark themes are actually pretty common in Shakespeare's comedies. For example, The Twelfth Night also has death in it. See, typically one of two things happens in Shakespeare tragedies when someone dies. Either they just die and they don't get any last words, or their last words are something a little more profound. Mercutio's death is unique because right to the last word, he's still telling jokes. It's almost like a parody of those profound last words. I mean, he's lying on the ground and he's bleeding. And he looks up and says, "Ask for me tomorrow and you shall find me a grave man," and famously, "a plague of both your houses." So if you're the audience watching this, you don't really know what's going on at this point. Is Mercutio actually dead? Is this a joke? He's still laughing, so we should still be laughing. Now certainly there's a bit of a tone shift here, but it's not quite gone to a tragedy yet. I mean, think about it, the second act of any romantic comedy is the part where things start to go wrong. I mean, typically, best friends don't die, but still, this is kind of going along with the romantic comedy tropes. So Romeo and Juliet are married in secret, but they have to part for a while. Juliet ends up deciding to fake her own death as a way to get away from her family. So you'd probably think at this part we've officially left comedy territory, but while Juliet is lying there, assumed to be dead on a table, the people who find her are actually supposed to do a little more than they typically do. See, in different versions of Romeo and Juliet, there are stage directions that have been rewritten or omitted entirely about all people crying out and wringing their hands all at once. Remember how I said that I'd come back to the nurse? Yeah, one of her lines in this scene, specifically, is, "Oh woe, oh woeful, woeful, woeful day." Now in some versions those lines have been divided and split amongst other characters, but that's a really boring way of doing it. The way that it was written is this very... It's a commotion. There's a lot going on, everyone is freaking out, Juliet is just laying there, the nurse is going crazy with worry. In fact, the scene has even been criticized because some people think that this scene should be a very dark and quiet moment and that this ridiculous going around is just too much, but that was the point of the scene. It's supposed to be ridiculous. But once again, that's the joke. Dramatic irony can be used for tension, which is why some people assume that this is a serious scene, but it can also be used for comedy. The audience knows that Juliet isn't really dead, so when we see this commotion going on, it's supposed to be a really funny scene. Remember, this is an audience that doesn't know how it ends yet. In fact, if the play ends here, it's been a successful comedy. But then Romeo finds her, and this is where the dramatic irony takes a huge shift. It's still funny up until we realize that Romeo is going crazy, which initially maybe is funny because everyone else went crazy too. But Romeo's unstable, like we already talked about. He's totally caught up in the throes of this young love. He's not in his right mind, and as we all know, he makes some poor decisions. See, at this point I definitely give up all arguments that the play is still a comedy. But the thing is, I don't think it's fair to say the entire play is a tragedy. It's been said that the easiest way to tell Shakespeare's comedies apart from his tragedies is at the end of a comedy, people get married, and at the end of a tragedy, everybody dies. Well, in Romeo and Juliet, they get married and then they die. From a more literary perspective, in his comedies, people overcome their flaws, where in his tragedies, they're consumed by them. Certainly in this story, Romeo and Juliet are consumed by their flaws, but the flaws aren't entirely on them. It's also the flaws of other people that sort of force them into this situation, and in fact, their deaths help resolve those flaws, because at the end of it, the families force themselves to put their differences aside. So does Romeo and Juliet result in tragedy? Well, yeah, absolutely. Is it a tragedy? I don't think it's fair to say yes. There's certainly little clues that this isn't going to end well. I mean, when Mercutio and Tybalt die, it's sort of a hint that things aren't going very well for Romeo and Juliet. But the play isn't designed to be one solid tragedy. The play is designed to bring you into their life and then drop this bomb on you that's supposed to resonate with you beyond the end of the play. Basically, Romeo and Juliet is a complicated play, and I think it's not fair to just label it a tragedy when you've got all of these other elements that build up to the ending. It's gotta start out funny so that the ending matters. And I think by ignoring a lot of that comedy and trying to make the entire thing more dramatic and serious, we're really taking away from the play as a whole. But I don't know. I mean, maybe the ending is the most important part, and so it is fair to call it a tragedy, and audiences change. We all know the story by now, so we can't really use that same sort of expectation that the audiences of the 16th and 17th century had. And of course, this is a play, so we'll never really know how it was originally performed. There is a pretty huge difference between reading it on paper and watching it on stage. But I think the fact that we're able to pull so much from just what's on the page is what's really impressive. As John Green has pointed out multiple times, it's sometimes more important what we get out of a text than the text itself. And I think that's just as true with something like Romeo and Juliet that's already been pretty well beaten into our cultural subconscious. Just because we were told things about it in high school doesn't mean that there isn't more to get. So sorry if this video was a little long. I haven't been Englishy for a while and I thought I should catch up. As for you, I'm curious what you would think of this opinion. And also, I have a challenge for you. I want you to try to make a video before the end of the year, and I know you're really busy with the holidays because it's Christmas and it's New Year's and there's lots of things going on and there's lots of snow outside, but I don't care, that's why it's a challenge. See ya.